Okay, we made it to week 4, and we're going to continue this week our study of the Renaissance. We're going to move into the period known as the High Renaissance. And that's roughly half, or maybe just a third, of what we're doing this week. The rest is going to be devoted more or less to this phenomenon we call the Protestant Reformation. Now, you may already have a pretty good idea of what we mean by Protestant Reformation, but I think it's valuable to break down those two words just for a moment to make sure we know exactly what we're talking about here. Let's start with the Reformation part of it. Okay, I think we all know what Reformation means, but what is being reformed, at least allegedly here? Well, with the Protestant Reformation, it is in fact the church. Okay? It is the church that needs, in the minds of many people, to be reformed, to be revitalized, and so on. Now, the word Protestant is less obvious. I think you can probably detect that it's related to the word protest. The name itself comes from a specific historical moment. In 1529, there was a meeting of German princes known as the Diet, spelled like, a food diet, but with a very different meaning. A diet is a meeting of important German princes in the Holy Roman Empire. There's a Diet of Speyer, S-P-E-Y-E-R. Diet of Speyer in 1529 reversed a policy of toleration that had been extended to German Lutherans. So, by 1529, Protestant Reformation had begun. Many people had left the Roman Catholic Church, inspired by Martin Luther. And prior to 1529, German Lutherans had been tolerated. They were free to some extent to live out their faith. Well, the Diet of Speyer reversed that decision so that German Lutherans lost those rights, lost that toleration. And the Lutheran princes who were present at the Diet formally protested that decision. And it's that protest that gives us the name Protestant. And eventually that term Protestant is going to be applied to any church or any person who sort of is not in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. Specifically, any Western Christian who is not in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. So that's where the word Protestant came from, and that's also what it came to mean. By the way, I think it's really important that every educated person know, especially every educated Christian know, that there are 3 major families of Christians in the world today, starting in the 16th century. We've got the Roman Catholic Church. We have the Eastern Orthodox churches, like the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and so on. Those churches and the Roman Catholic Church divorced several centuries prior to the Protestant Reformation. And then we have Protestantism. Now, within each of those families, there is some division and dissension and so on, but those are the 3 major types of Christians in the world today. All right, so that's what Protestant Reformation means. The Protestant Reformation refers to the attempt to reform the church, not from within, but by forming new churches that are not in any way formally affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church. So that's the what. Now the question is, so what? What is the big deal? Why does the Protestant Reformation deserve so much of our attention in this course? Well, I think first of all, you just have to appreciate how momentous it was at the time. Because for basically 1,500 years, the Western Church though not without controversy and some degree of dissension, the Western Church was more or less united. Okay? So if you're a medieval Christian, living in the 12th century or something like that, there's really just one church as far as you're concerned. But what happens in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation is Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put it back together again. As soon as the church fractures and fragments, that process cannot be reversed. Okay, so there's going to be all these divisions that are still very much with us today. I mean, today there are literally thousands, some scholars would even say tens of thousands, of different Protestant groups worldwide. Okay, so if you prefer something a little bit more, sophisticated than a Humpty Dumpty metaphor, Pandora's box might be another, right? Once you open up Pandora's box and everything comes out, there's no way to sort of get it back in. So it introduced division into the Western Church that we're still living with today. And last year, 2017, was actually the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And I'd like to hope that Protestants and Catholics alike would use that occasion as an opportunity to reflect on the Reformation and sort of how we should respond to it. What everyone thinks about it, whether you think the Protestant Reformation is one of the greatest things that ever happened in Western history, or if you think it's one of the greatest tragedies that ever occurred, and you can find plenty of people who would subscribe to both views. Everyone, I think, who knows anything about the Reformation will agree that it's one of the most momentous events in Western history, and not just for its religious ramifications, but it fundamentally changes Western culture in many ways. And some would argue today that even though the Reformation it predates modernity, many people would argue that many features of the Western world that we take for granted today originally stem from the Protestant Reformation. I'll give you just two examples of that. The Protestant Reformation helps to popularize an idea that there is no higher authority than the individual conscience. So there's a kind of emphasis on the individual conscience that I think is very much still with us today. And the more sort of negative side of that is that the Protestant Reformation helped to foster a rather negative view of tradition that is still with us today, especially among 21st century Americans. Tradition is often a word with very negative connotations, and I think you could argue that that goes all the way back to the 16th century in the Protestant Reformation. All right, so I now want to think just for a moment about how to go about studying this complicated phenomenon that we call the Protestant Reformation. I think there are lots of obstacles that could get in the way of a profitable and edifying study of the Protestant Reformation. I think the first obstacle is simply our own biases. I don't think there's any Western Christian today that approaches the Protestant Reformation in a totally neutral sort of way. To use the most obvious example, Catholics and Protestants are simply going to have different attitudes and outlooks on the Protestant Reformation. And even within Protestants, there's going to be a tendency to put your own tradition in the best possible light and maybe put other Protestant traditions in a less favorable light. Now, on the one hand, in some ways there's nothing we can do about that. Nobody can achieve absolute objectivity. But in order to do history well, and one of the things I hope that you learn from this course is what it means to actually do history and to do it well. In order to do history well, you at least have to make an effort to try to put yourself in the shoes of another, to try to see the world as others see it, even if those others um, are in a different group than you. So I hope we can all make that effort to try to understand. I mean, that's really what historians are trying to do first and foremost. Understand why people thought and behaved in the way they did, rather than simply to judge people. There are a few other, I think, confusions that also need to be cleared up before we really get into the study of the Protestant Reformation. I think one confusion is the idea that the Protestant reformers basically just consigned all Roman Catholics to hell and created these new churches without really any thought to the Roman Catholic Church. I think we have to remember, and I think you'll see this in your study this week, that the original and ultimate aim of the Protestant reformers was in fact to reform the church. Okay? And for them, the church included the Roman Catholic Church, which they thought was in abysmal shape, to be sure. But their hope was that through their own efforts, real reform might actually take hold in the Roman Church as well. And if we think about the original Protestant reformer, Martin Luther, it's a matter of historical fact that he did not leave the Roman Catholic Church so much as he was expelled from it. So that was not his original aim. It happened, and he had to deal with it in the best way that he thought that he could. But even afterwards, Martin Luther harbored a hope that his efforts might actually bear some fruit, some positive fruit in the Roman Church. Another obstacle to the study of the Reformation is the tendency that people have to reduce the Protestant reformers to a kind of caricature, to a kind of stereotype, so that each of the Protestant reformers is basically a kind of one-trick pony. So Martin Luther, he's the justification by faith guy. John Calvin is Mr. Predestination. The Anabaptists are the weird pacifists, and so on. I think what you're going to find is that the reformers were pretty complicated people. And the movements that they inspired were pretty complicated movements. Just to give you one example, I think there's a very typical knock on Luther, and especially on Calvin, that by emphasizing justification by faith alone, salvation by faith alone, and not through works, that these reformers really downplayed the importance of the Christian life, right? Because, if you're just saved through grace alone, then and what you do in this world doesn't really matter in terms of your salvation, then it doesn't really matter how you live. That's what people assume about Luther and Calvin. If you actually read Luther and Calvin, and if you read their disciples, you'll find that they actually had lots to say about the Christian life, and they thought it was very, very important that Christians actually lived like Christians. So we have these kind of popular cliches about these figures that don't really help us understand them better and don't help us to appreciate the complexity of these figures and their movements. Another point that we need to keep in mind, lest we really misunderstand what the Reformation is all about, I think there's a popular notion that the reformers were sort of all working together on the same team, right? They all oppose the Roman Catholic Church, and so they all kind of worked hand in hand in order to offer an alternative to the Roman Catholic Church. Well, for one thing, pay very close attention to Dr. Farmer's lecture for this week, because he's going to give you a very nice kind of model for understanding just how diverse the Protestant reformers were. There is a very broad spectrum when it comes to Protestant reformers. There's going to be a kind of extreme right wing, a kind of extreme left wing, and there's going to be lots of territory in between for more moderate groups. So the Protestants of the 16th century, far from being a united front, this was a very factious group. And groups of Protestants, in many cases, hated one another with a passion that sometimes exceeded their hatred for the Roman Church. So we cannot think about there being, two big blocks in the 16th century, the Catholics and the Protestants. No, the Protestants are often at odds with one another. So don't lose sight of that as well. The final thing that I don't want you to lose sight of, this will come out in your reading in one of your Western World readings this week, is the idea that the Reformation, that the Protestants have a monopoly on the Reformation, right? So a lot of people, when they think about the Reformation, they immediately think about Protestant leaders, Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, and so on. But scholars today talk about a Catholic Reformation in the 16th century as well, because there were many Catholics, Erasmus, as we've seen, is among them, many Catholics in the 16th century who don't join up with the Protestants, nevertheless believe that there are many problems plaguing the Catholic Church that need to be addressed, that need to be rectified in some way or another. Now, you'll read in West in the World that the Roman Catholic Church's sort of official response to the Protestant movement comes in the middle of the 16th century in a very famous council, the Council of Trent. And at the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Church acknowledges that there are problems, there are abuses in the Catholic Church. They need to be acknowledged, they need to be addressed, they need to be corrected. Just to give you one example, Trent acknowledges that the sale of indulgences has led to some abuses. Okay. So there's a kind of acknowledgement there. On the other hand, the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Council, was willing to give no quarter, make no compromises when it came to church doctrine itself. Okay? So people like Luther and Calvin are going to have major problems with Roman Catholic teaching. And the Council of Trent said, look, Roman Catholic Church may have some problems, but those problems are not doctrinal. The doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church is sound, and we are going to batten down the hatches, and we are not going to give an inch on that. Okay? So there were efforts to reform the Catholic Church from the inside by Roman Catholics, but almost always those efforts were targeted moral problems, spiritual problems. And again, Erasmus is a great example of this. There's also going to be a number of sort of renewal movements that will pop up in the Catholic Church in the course of the 16th century. You're going to read about a very famous Catholic figure, Ignatius of Loyola, Ignatius, Ignatius of Loyola, Loyola. He is the founder of the Jesuit order, Jesuit. Incidentally, the current Pope, Pope Francis, is the first ever Jesuit Pope. Ignatius of Loyola was such an important figure. The Jesuits become really the most important Christian missionaries of the 16th century. And so movements like that really showed the rest of the world that the Roman Catholic Church was still very much a vital spiritual institution, no matter what Protestants might have to say. So again, the point is that it's not only the Protestants who were interested in the reform of the church. There were many Catholics who were also interested in reform as well. Last point I want to make in this video. We spent last week studying the Renaissance. We're going to continue our study of the Renaissance this week. What in the world do the Renaissance and the Reformation have to do with each other, if anything? Because after all, they overlap chronologically. Now, the Renaissance gets started in the 1400s, so it begins earlier than the Reformation. But when the Reformation gets off the ground in the early 16th century, the Renaissance is still going on, right? So people like Martin Luther and Michelangelo, these guys are contemporaries. Now, what do these figures have in common? What do these movements have in common? Do they have anything in common at all? Because in many ways, on the face of it, they don't seem to have anything in common. In fact, they seem to be perhaps not only disconnected phenomena, but antithetical phenomena. Think about it, right? The Renaissance, you hear the word Renaissance, what do you think of immediately? You think of art, great art. Well, think about the Protestant Reformation for a moment. If you look at West in the World, page 337, you're going to see a bunch of Protestants gleefully destroying art. Okay, so not only were most Protestant reformers not terribly interested in art, some of them saw art as part of the problem because they saw art, at least religious art, as tantamount to idolatry. So that would seem to suggest that the Renaissance and the Reformation were sort of at cross purposes. Also consider the fact that Luther's 95 Theses, which you'll read about, was prompted by the indulgence campaign, an indulgence campaign that was part of a larger effort by the papacy to raise money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, the very same St. Peter's Cathedral whose dome was designed by none other than Michelangelo. So again, anecdotes like that suggest that the Renaissance and the Reformation may actually represent sort of contradictory and antithetical impulses. Then if you look at geography, geography also seems to suggest that the Renaissance and the Reformation were sort of two ships passing in the night. The Renaissance, the heartland of the Renaissance, of course, is in Italy. But the heartland of the Protestant Reformation is in Northern Europe. Okay, places like Northern Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Scotland, places like that. So again, the geography of this suggests that the Renaissance and the Reformation are disconnected and in some ways opposed to one another. But what I want to suggest in closing is that there are actually some points of connection between these two phenomena. Perhaps there was some real opposition, but there's some real common ground as well. And I want to mention two of the isms that we discussed last week as being characteristic of the Renaissance. And the one that I think that affords the best bridge to the Reformation is humanism, right? Humanism, this idea that culture can and should be renewed by returning to the classical world, the world of Greek and Roman antiquity. And if you look at the Protestant reformers, many, not all necessarily, but many of them had a deep love for Greco-Roman antiquity. This is certainly true of people like John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli. Furthermore, think about Erasmus for a moment. Now, we all know Erasmus did not join up with the Protestant movement, but he was very interested in the reform of the church, and he was a humanist. He believed that the best way to renew and reform the church is to return to the original sources of the church from antiquity. So return to the church fathers, but return above all to the Bible. And not just to the Bible, but to the Bible in its original languages of Hebrew and Greek. Now, you're going to see that in my lecture on John Calvin this week, that Calvin was very, very invested in the education of pastors, and he thought that the education of pastors should include education in the original biblical languages. In other words, any pastor who's going to be preaching regularly, teaching regularly, ought to be able to read the Bible in its original languages. And that is a strong humanist tendency on the part of John Calvin. So we see humanism as animating both the Renaissance and, in a slightly different way, the Reformation as well. The second ism that I think bridges the two movements is individualism. And we've seen and will continue to see how individualism manifests itself in the arts. I think the most obvious example would be the profusion of portraits and even artistic self-portraits during the Renaissance. This week you're going to look at Raphael's portrait of Leo X. You're going to look at some self-portraits, the self-portraits of Albert Dürer, for example. So I think that is very much a manifestation of individualism. Well, individualism is kind of baked into the DNA of the Reformation as well. Think of what I said at the very beginning of this video about the individual conscience, the importance of the individual conscience, which trumps tradition, which trumps even the hierarchy of the church. So one's own individual conscience ought to be followed, even if it's in conflict with church authorities or church tradition or what have you. I think that's yet another sort of form of individualism. So even though there are some important differences between the Renaissance and the Reformation, there is some common ground between them in addition to their chronological overlap. All right, well, more in the next video about the Luther and Calvin readings for this week.